Hey everybody, welcome to this week's Q&A. Looks like we got a bunch of questions, so I'm just going to jump straight into it. I'll start with the newest over on Patreon, because why not? Mike Strobel was wondering if the RetroTink SCART would benefit from the firmware update just made available for the 2X Pro, asking because the picture from their Neo Geo is definitely off from the top of the screen, and it's cut off by at least one row of pixels. They're wondering if the firmware update would correct this, because it seems that the new firmware has recenters the image vertically. So I'm pretty sure that the firmwares are not compatible between devices because there's different features on each. So the RetroTink 2X, there's no input button, there's no pass-through button, so it's going to be a different firmware. So I'm pretty sure if it worked at all, you would brick your device. So definitely don't try that. But maybe reach out to Mike Chi, the creator of these products, and see if he plans on porting that firmware over. I've had some pretty awesome results with the 2X SCART, although depending on some Neo Geos, I did see some weird issues with it that I think is related to the Neo Geo, not the Tink 2X SCART. But yeah, I mean, it's kind of a weird thing because they're all based off the same technology but different firmwares. So I don't know. I hope he ports as much over as he can because I always love to see free updates like this for people that already bought it. But I don't have any solid info, so sorry. Other solid info other than probably best not to try it because it'll probably brick it. Bo Lee had a question about converting SVideo to RGB SCART, and it looks like they have a 3DO that's outputting SVideo and are going to pick up a PCFX, which also outputs SVideo, and they bought a cheap SVideo to SCART adapter, but it doesn't seem to work. So there's two things that you need to remember in this scenario. The first and the most important one is there's a difference between converting a connector and converting a signal. What you bought just converted the connector of SVideo to the connector SCART. You could even get those for VGA and many others as well, but all you're doing is passing that same YC Luma Chroma signal through a different connector on the end, but not changing the signal. What you're going to need is something that actually changes Luma and Chroma to a different signal that your setup is able to interpret. Now, the goal here is the target device. So if your target device is a flat screen and a capture card, by far the easiest way to do this is just go into a RetroTink 2X. And since you have multiple devices, you'll probably want to get a cheap SVideo switch. Just grab something online. You can get Extrons, which is pretty cheap, but for now, just buy the cheapest one just to get you started. Go from there into the RetroTink and then output HDMI to those devices. But if there's different steps in there, that's where it's going to get a lot more complicated. HDMI is the easy part these days. If you're going into an RGB SCART setup because your target device is an RGB monitor, I don't know of a good solution that's easy that goes from SVideo to SCART. What you could do, and this is pretty complicated and you could damage your equipment if you do this wrong, but you could go from SVideo into something like the RetroTink 2X and convert that output from HDMI to VGA. And then from there, you would then have to run that into like an Extron RGB interface that accepts VGA in, VGA meaning RGB HV. So you would put the RetroTink in pass-through mode, so it still passes through 240p. And then from the output of the Extron box, you would want RGBS. And then you would need to make sure it's the correct voltage for your equipment. So pretty complicated. So that would mean SVideo into RetroTink, into HDMI to VGA converter, into a sync combiner circuit of sorts. The Extron boxes are probably the cheapest. You can find them used for like $20. And then a custom cable that goes from RGBS to SCART, probably requiring a resistor on the sync line to make sure the voltage isn't too high. Alternatively, you could just go from SVideo to component video using the Core U transcoder. And if your SCART setup passes through component video and your target device accepts it, you could do it that way too. But once again, it's not RGB SCART. You're going into component video, and then same thing, getting a different converter for the connector, not the signal. So it's kind of a tricky one. I don't know of a direct SVideo to RGB converter out there that's easily available and reasonably priced. I've seen a few on eBay, but it would be cheaper to just get your 3DO modded at that point. So it's kind of a complicated one. So if you want to follow up with your target devices, I could try to help a little bit more. But hopefully you're just going to HDMI, because then it's very simple. Just buy either an original RetroTink 2X or the RetroTink 2X Pro. Roy Meyer wants to run a Nintendo DS emulator on both their broadcast monitor as well as on a handheld screen, but they're not sure how to do it. They recently bought a TV1 C2 750, so they're trying to find an emulator in which they could use to divide the top and bottom screen into two separate windows. By doing this, they could display the top screen on their broadcast monitor and then cast the bottom screen to your smartphone screen. Do you know an emulator which can split the screens into two windows, or do you have a better idea on how they could accomplish this? Latency of the bottom screen doesn't bother me too much because it usually just shows maps or menus. That is a super complicated thing to accomplish, and I don't know if it's plausible for reasonable performance. So don't mean to shoot down your idea or anything like that, but now you're talking about running an emulator with emulation lag, going through a converter that adds about 2 frames of lag to downscale to something else, and then running it on your smartphone screen. I'm not sure if that's a realistic project. If you could figure it out, do a video on it. I'm sure somebody would be interested. But I think if money isn't an option, the better thing for you to do would be to find a Nitro DS capture, not the Nitro DS emulator. The capture is something that you just plug your DS, or I guess Game Boy Advance games even, into it, and it outputs via 2 Nintendo multi-out connectors. The maximum is SVideo, but it's a very good signal, and you could output to 2 different screens as well as use the Nintendo DS that's connected to it. Now, the Nitro DS emulator works the same, but you have to keep that connected to a PC. And I think I might actually know a few people that have some emulators for sale, but they're generally less expensive because you have to have them tethered to a PC. And I've never done that. I've talked to people that have, but you basically need to load up software. You load the ROMs through the PC onto the emulator box. But same scenario. You could use the Nintendo DS in order to actually play the game. And, you could still look at the DS if you want. Obviously, you'd probably need to for the touchscreen stuff. But then you could output to 2 separate monitors, and I believe there's even dip switch settings to try to do both in the same, but that comes out 480i, so it doesn't look very good. The way I've always done it is 2 screens, 2 RGB monitors on top of each other. I had 2 8-inch monitors that I used for this, so top screen was top, bottom screen was bottom, and you still play on the DS. So I guess DM me if you need more info on where to pick those up. Just remember that there's 2, the Nitro DS emulator and the Nitro DS capture. I could try to put you in touch with the right people, but your original idea sounds cool. You're going to end up with like 4 or 5 frames of lag minimum on all devices, and I don't even know if it's possible. So once again, no disrespect, very cool idea. I just don't think it could be done, or easily at least. Chris Manichek had a few questions. I'm going to answer every one of them, but I'm not going to read the whole question just to keep things flowing. But first off, they want to know how to get their PS2 working into their XRGB Mini. That's the easiest, and easiest with the best quality. So high-quality component video cables into the D-terminal component adapter is the easiest and best way for the XRGB Mini FrameMeister. There was mentioned, do you just get a direct D-terminal adapter for the PlayStation 2? I wouldn't even know where to get those, so I would just stick with high-quality cables like the HD Retrovisions. You mentioned you had Monster cables. Those should be fine as well, and use the adapter. You also mentioned JP21, and I just wanted to remind everybody that I think there was some misinformation out there about the FrameMeister that you needed JP21 cables, and you don't at all. You just need to pick up the standard SCART version of the SCART to XRGB Mini adapter, not the JP21 to XRGB pinout one. I think a lot of people ended up buying JP21 cables, but now they're kind of left with a solution where there's only one switch out there that's really compatible with it that you could buy now. Now it's confusing which of your setup is JP21, which is SCART. So just as a generalization, unless you have a very specific scientific reason for using JP21. I would always just use SCART. It's just so much easier to deal with. Next is a question about the Dreamcast. They're a huge fan of it and have a good collection of US and Japanese games. Their current setup uses the Toro and RGB with the XRGB Mini and want to know if they're going to get a superior picture quality by going direct HDMI, such as the Akura or the DC HDMI mod. So any plug-and-play solution that's HDMI for the Dreamcast is going to be about the same or maybe even not as good as going into a scaler. So you have the Toro into the FrameMeister, the Toro into the OSSC, are both going to be better for a bunch of reasons. The way the signal's presented, how high you could scale the signal, 960p in most cases versus 480p if you go direct out. However, the DC HDMI direct digital to digital mod just blows all of them away. The image is formatted correctly. It goes up to 1080p. My preference is 960p into my OLED because it kind of does both the sharp integer stretch to 960p, and then my TV stretches that soft to 4K. And what I end up with is a Dreamcast that kind of looks like a PS3. It's pretty incredible, at least on my TV, how good the scaling looks. Whereas if you go to 1080p, it's 960p in the window. So it's a different, I don't know, my TV kind of treats that a little bit differently, but it's absolutely worth picking up if you're a massive Dreamcast fan. And the last question is, for getting a second Dreamcast, is there a good use, or how to make use of VGA output on a separate monitor? So if space isn't an issue, if you want a second Dreamcast station, I would pick up any VGA monitor, anything, a $10 one from Craigslist that, with the yellowed case, whatever, and then just get a decent quality but, cheap VGA solution. Or I guess if you get the DC HDMI, you could then utilize the Toro that you already own for the same thing, because it's kind of the best of everything. Now on your main setup, you have everything going HDMI into your OLED TV, and on your secondary setup, you enjoy CRTs. You could use light gun games. I'm pretty sure the 480p capable games will work on anything. I don't think the 480i only light gun games would work on a VGA monitor, but whatever. So that would be my suggestion if it's possible. If you just want to utilize an existing flat screen you already own, once again, DC HDMI is going to be by far the best solution, but pretty much any kind of just basic HDMI converter like the Gecko or the Akura would just get it done. So you don't have to worry about if it's 16:9 or 4:3 because those devices should be able to handle that. Worst case, your monitor probably has an aspect ratio control in there. Almost all of them do. So that would be the worst case, is if it, whatever solution you get outputs a 16:9 signal and you don't need to squish it in or vice versa. But honestly, the step from any Dreamcast plug-and-play solution to the DC HDMI for a big Dreamcast fan is a big noticeable difference. Casual Dreamcast users probably wouldn't notice the difference. I mean that respectfully. It's just, I could just look at Zelda Link to the Past and tell you what model Super Nintendo is being used, what scaler you're using, just because I love the system, I love the game, and I've seen it so often. But I could never do that with something like a PC Engine. I couldn't just look at that and go, oh, that's the original core graphics or something like that. Whereas you probably would be able to on the Dreamcast. You'd probably be able to walk up to something like a really nice OLED and go, oh, that's a plug-and-play solution. That's a bad plug-and-play solution. That's the DC HDMI. That's the FrameMeister. So hopefully that kind of puts everything into perspective. If you need me to elaborate any more on any of these, just let me know, and I'll try my best to help out. Roy Meyer wants to know if there's a good automatic BNC video switch. Right now they have an automatic SCART switch, but don't like SCART very much because the cables come loose all the time and they break easy. So a couple answers to this. First, no, I don't know of any automatic BNC video switch. Next, on the SCART side, I do agree that SCART is really annoying, but unless cables are being moved around, they never pop out of my G-SCART switch. They're always in there pretty solid. One thing you could do if you really are having this issue is grab a hot glue gun, and I know people are going to be rolling their eyes, but stay with me here for a moment, and just a dab, just like a dab in the upper right corner and the bottom left corner, just a tiny little bit, because hot glue is so easily removable and it shouldn't damage most things. So if you really need a solution to keep them in there, that's certainly something that would work. You could use tape and stuff like that too, but to be honest, tape might actually leave more of a residue or anything. But I mean, you could, I guess, use blue painter's tape and just wrap all of the connectors in together as one to kind of lock them in. Those are all plausible ways to keep them in there. As far as they break easily, any custom cable, especially shielded cable, where you have this giant, thick, shielded cores inside another shielded other cable, if you move those around, they're going to break at some point. So, that's why, depending on your setup, I never recommend one cable brand, because even though they're all, in the scenario of you put them all on a table and you plug it in, they're all kind of equal these days. Some are better fighting against outside interference, but they're not as durable. Others are super, super durable, but if you put it next to a bunch of power outlets, you might possibly get a tiny bit of interference, most likely not. But so that's the downsides of SCART and using shielded cables, is you got to kind of pick and choose your poison. For me, because I have two setups. I have a rack with my D32 on it that pretty much nothing changes. Occasionally I'll pull a console out of there, but the cables don't move. And then I have another setup where everything's in a drawer, and that's what I use for testing. And the stuff that I'm constantly plugging in and removing breaks all the time because I abuse them, because I'm constantly messing with it for testing. Whereas the stuff that's in my rack that's kind of just sitting there, never being touched, the cables are barely ever moved, those are perfect. They never pop out, they never break, nothing else. So it really kind of is dependent on your setup. I mean, the other thing you could do is you could find yourself an automatic VGA switch that's compatible with RGBS and make yourself custom cables from console to VGA connector. Once again, you're not converting the signal to 480p 31 kilohertz VGA. You're simply taking that same 15 kilohertz signal and putting it through a VGA style connector. I found a switch years ago that worked with it. I did end up getting a little bit of interference, but I also think it's because I had a 20-foot run of VGA cable running across the wall to get to a different setup. But so that was a really long way of saying you might just want to stick with your SCART setup and find better ways to reinforce it. No, I don't know of an automatic BNC switch, but maybe somebody has some custom thing for an Extron that'll work. But hopefully I was able to lay out different options so you could kind of envision your own setup and choose what's best for you. Bamboo Shadow said that on my review for the Otaku SCART switch, I talk about how sending the input signal to both outputs simultaneously could decrease the signal quality, dim it, and possibly even damage the console or input device. While they understand that the unamplified signal, since it's a passive device, definitely has to decrease in some ways, they were scared that hearing this setup could also damage the console. I, for myself, use a passive SVideo splitter for over 2 years on my Super Famicom NTSC GameCube, and while they did notice a brightness loss, they didn't realize any other bad effects could happen with this setup. The capture card was also able to handle the signal just fine, while there was no signal quality loss visible compared to a direct connection. So maybe they were just lucky that the consoles didn't take any damage yet. Or is it a different thing using SVideo or component video? So this is one of those cases where, and I know this is not what you said, by the way. I'm just using an extreme example to try to put things in a better perspective. But this is the exact same scenario as somebody saying, oh, I've drank a bottle of whiskey and smoked a pack of cigarettes every day since I was 16 and I'm still alive, so it's not going to hurt you. That hopefully is a great analogy for stuff like this. When you do things like pull two or have two outputs of one source without an active powered splitter, you're pulling twice the amount of current from that target or from the source device. So in doing so, what you end up doing is really taxing the video processor on that. And I had a Super Nintendo that I wired up an RGB setup to, and I just wanted to do for like a 5-minute quick video capture thing. I had split the RGB signal to two devices, and I was also outputting composite and SVideo, not split. and the thing died in about 30 seconds. I've also had a few other scenarios like yours where I did the splitting thing for a while because the trade-off for me was, look, I got to get this done. I got to make the video. I got to do the test whatever product I was helping on at that time, and it was absolutely fine. So it's really a risk to reward thing. If you're talking about a GameCube and you have a whole bunch of them, they're still kind of inexpensive and they've been running for years like this, maybe kind of just say, okay, this GameCube's probably not going to last as long as it would have, so I'm just going to keep using it till it dies. That's your choice, but it's definitely not good for it. And it's a lot of stuff like this in the retro gaming world where there's a lot of arguments of like, oh, I've been doing it and it works fine. Why should I stop? If you don't mind lessening the life of your console, then don't. Everything's totally cool, but you will absolutely shorten the life of something when you use it in a way that it wasn't designed to be used. Now, there could be other things involved that I don't know about. So a good example is the THS video amps that are used in almost all of these RGB mods are designed to drive 2 outputs. So you could 100% split the output from the 7374 to 2 different output connectors. Use that 24/7, and that console's life will not be shortened. So I don't know enough about what the SVideo output on a GameCube is. For all I know, the chip in there is designed to handle a little bit more, and it's totally fine. I don't know. I just would always err on the side of caution and not do stuff like that. Just because, knowing my luck, it wouldn't be the completely stock GameCube that I got for $20 at a yard sale that died. It would be the ultra rare thing that means a lot to me that I want to preserve. So it's really just a matter to you of deciding on, is preserving this console to last as long as it can important? Is your current setup perfect and you don't want to change it? And if the board dies, you could use that GameCube for parts to fix other ones you own. It's your decision. For me, it always just comes down to I just want to make sure to make these consoles last as long as possible for me and whoever gets them afterwards. And there's always different solutions out there for most things. So if you're talking about the GameCube, you could certainly get yourself maybe a crazy setup, but one that would work would either be the MK2, the Mark II from Eon. That'll do simultaneous dual output, or a Carby HDMI to an HDMI splitter, one going to your capture card and the other one going to an HDMI to component converter. I would pick whichever's cheaper. I actually think the Carby solution is cheaper, as long as you have enough room for all those extra adapters. So totally up to you. I by no means did I mean to splitter shame you or anything like that. Please don't misunderstand. I'm very often misunderstood, and it's almost always my fault because I don't explain it the right way. My apologies. I like to answer these questions without reading them first so that you get like a true answer from me. So hopefully that came out okay, and I didn't screw anything up or make you feel bad. I really was just trying to get you the right information and provide reasons why and alternatives. So if you need me to elaborate on any of that stuff, please let me know. Marky Mark 5127 had a few questions. First, without modding consoles or using an old VHS player, what's the best lag-free way to get an RF-only console to HDMI that's affordable? There isn't one yet. There's rumors of stuff coming, but probably not for a year. And it's probably going to be more expensive than a retro tank. So it would be infinitely cheaper to just pick up, especially if you could find a VCR that powers on but maybe eats tapes and doesn't work. You could probably get one of those for free or $5 or something. So it's way easier to go from there and take the composite video output into a retro tank. That's going to be by far cheaper, zero lag, as long as it's an older VCR, not one of the newer ones that processes the signal. So if it's got component video output, or if it's got component or HDMI on that VCR, don't use it for this. And yes, there were some VHS DVD combos that did output HDMI. As long as it's not one of those, you should be totally fine. But I'll let everybody know when there's other solutions out there. But unfortunately, RF is just a kind of a weird thing. So either modding your console or using the VHS player is really the only cheap, lag-free, easy way to do it that doesn't require modding. Also, they recently got a Flim Flam Meadow Games 4-player cocktail arcade. That sounds kind of cool. Worked fine until recently the sound stopped working. The caps look good, but they're unsure what to do after that. Any suggestions? So there's a bunch of things. So I'm going to list them out real quick, and then I'll explain them. Still have dead caps, bad traces on the motherboard, bad sound chips, and I think that's probably the top 3 for me. Bad speaker, that's always an easy one. So just because the caps aren't leaking doesn't mean they're still good. The fluid could have dried up and not leaked out. So anytime you have a much older electronics device that you want to preserve, taking the time to do a full list of capacitors, order them all, do a cap replacement on it, it's always a good thing to ensure that it's going to last, I mean, way longer than intended, especially if you spend the extra money, which isn't that much more money, but you get some really high quality capacitors. When these things were made, they were designed to last like 5 to 15 years. I'm kind of guessing on the numbers here, but they were not designed to last forever. They were designed for arcade techs to go in there and constantly be updating these things. So, and also, if you have something that was mass produced, having 4 times the price of the capacitors for thousands is going to really kill your profit margin. So, but collectors spending the extra money, that 4 times the price, that means, it's $20 to $80 or $100, if depending on how many caps there are. That would probably be a worthy investment because you'll probably never have to do that again. So that's one of them. Other sound chips, there's always other chips that can go bad. Jose is modding my MK2 motherboard right now, and it looks like it's not the capacitors. It looks like it's actually a sound chip problem. So he's replacing both of those. And the other thing to look for is bad traces on the board. So a lot of arcade boards you'll see are like bending or bowing. Even ones that were mounted vertically on their side I've still seen some of those kind of do that. And as the board flexes and the trace pulls either way, it could break that trace even in a very small way. So it's not something that's easy to figure out. You would then have to trace each point back and forth to find where the broken trace is, and then run a jumper wire along it or something like that. So it's pretty complicated, and that's why a lot of this old arcade repair stuff. I always joke about my modding skills, but I'm a decent modder. I could hold my own. I could do mods that are good, but very often, stuff like this, I'll send to experts, because while I could do a cap replacement, while I could, figure out what the sound chip is and replace those, once anything happens past that, that's really an expert level thing, especially tracing out stuff to find which connections are wrong. How do you know what's like voltage to ground versus pin to pin? Like it's not something that a beginner or an intermediate person could get easily. So just my thoughts on that one. Also, how can they contribute to the wiki or website? I'm a software engineer by trade and would like to support the community. Not much of a writer, but I would like to help out. Thank you so much. There are going to be plenty of room for very generous folks like yourself to help out. There's already a bunch of people. The core group that we've seen in the videos before have been helping. We get more writers on all the time, and we are going to need contributions to the wiki and web work when it all opens up to the public, which is fairly soon. There was a bunch of projects in place, and I don't know if things going on now are going to delay those, but hopefully speaking, anybody like yourself that wants to contribute in any way could do so, both on Retro RGB and on the upcoming wiki. So please just stay tuned. It will come out soon. And once again, I know I sound like a broken record, but we keep making the decision to delay it because we need a solid backbone. So if you get 6 months into a wiki and a bunch of people are contributing all these amazing things, and you decide, I want to rearrange the pages. I want this one to be here. I want this to be the landing page. That's nothing. That's, as you know, of course, that's like a few hours worth of work and maybe some redirects and whatever. But if your backbone needs to be changed, the way people log in, the way things are stored, the way corrections are handled, the way reversing changes are handled, if you want to change that 6 months into it, I mean, you might as well just delete everything and start from scratch. It would be more work almost to try to convert something. So we want to launch it when we know we have the backbone that we want, that's designed for longevity. We want this to outlast our grandkids. We want this to last as long as there is an internet. And I also want everybody that needs to store information that has anything to do with electronics or games to be able to do so. So that's the delays. And it is coming. It is, there's no way this project's getting canceled. It might keep getting delayed because that's life, but thank you for offering, and it will absolutely come out. And one more, a good video series idea is getting submissions of others' retro setups and explaining their setups with their brand, price of switches, cables, etc. Similar to somebody whose name I don't recognize does with the gaming PC and setup series. I love that idea. I'd actually love to do that more in person. I think everything that I do always comes out better in person, whether it's an interview or stuff like this. But that's pretty cool. That's at the moment for me, time is my biggest factor. So I have a bunch of videos queued up. I have a to-do list that's 1,000 pages long, and that's one of the many things I'd love to eventually get to. But I'm trying to adhere to 3 videos a week minimum, plus all the other stuff that I do. So Monday or Tuesday a video, the weekly roundup, and then these. But if time ever allows, I would certainly love to do stuff like that just for fun. Even starting out with just my friends and showing their setups and kind of doing like I did when I went out to visit a few friends and showed their setup, kind of like that, but more in depth. So all great ideas, all good questions, and thanks again for this the offer to help with the wiki. You are welcome the moment it opens up. ABO Hiccups said that they have batteries sitting inside a bunch of devices that are leaking. Is there an easy method to clean leaked battery damage off electronics and make it work again? So there's a bunch of different methods I've heard over the years. I'm not sure which is the safest or best, but regardless of what the solution is, I suggest taking everything apart. So for like the wireless game controller or even like a Game Boy system, I would take everything apart and make sure that any of the leakage or anything that you find didn't go inside the console or on the circuit board, to make sure that it doesn't corrode the traces. If it is at that point just on the different connectors, you could try to find replacement ones on eBay. There's always good parts for stuff like that available. And I've read many different things over the years about submerging it in, since it's an acid, submerging it in a base, using an electronics brush, which is essentially looks like a toothbrush, and scrubbing it off that way. I would really just research those, and based on your setup, what's the easiest for you overall. But the only point I want to make is definitely whatever it is that's the batteries are leaking inside, take it apart and make sure there isn't further damage than just the battery connector, the spring thing on the battery itself. Also, for me personally, I take my batteries out of everything that I'm not regularly using. So like my Sega Nomad, that is now, ever since I got the triple bypass installed, that is my go-to test console. It is freaking awesome. I use it all the time, anytime I need to test any RGB setup. But I use it, 5 days a week. So I just leave my Analogue batteries in there, and I don't worry about it because they die fast enough where I have to pull them out, recharge them, and I get to constantly see them. But none of my Wiimotes, none of my handhelds, not even the Wii sensor bar that I have, the battery powered one, I don't leave batteries in any of those just for this same reason. So maybe like one thing I haven't done, but it's probably a good idea, is have like 2 places to store your rechargeable batteries. One where they're fully charged, and the other one's like your grab off the shelf whenever you need batteries type of thing, and wear those down to nothing. And I'm pretty sure with all batteries, it's always best to discharge them before fully recharging them. I think that it keeps the life extended a little bit longer. Maybe the technology's improved, I don't know. But yeah, those are definitely my battery-related suggestions. Mike W. is following up on their question about Super Nintendo SCART cable issues. They said their RGB modded SNES Junior used a cable that was incompatible with a stock Super Famicom. They got a new RGB cable that does work with the Super Famicom, and they were able to short 2 pads on the RGB mod board in the Junior to set it to work with that same cable. So the question is about what they got wrong in the previous post. Is it correct to say that a SNES typically outputs TTL level on the RGB pins and requires components in the RGB cable to bring the voltage down to safe levels? Yes-ish. So it's correct to say that a Super Nintendo needs components in the cable on the RGBS lines. Now, the components on the RGB lines in a Super Nintendo are just capacitors, I'm pretty sure, unless I'm somehow drawing a blank on this. But on the sync line, it's both a resistor and a capacitor, because all Super Nintendos typically output TTL sync on the C-Sync line. But your visualization is correct, and it applies especially to consoles like the Sega Genesis, because the Sega Genesis requires both resistors and capacitors on all four, whereas the Super Nintendo requires capacitors on all four, but just resistors on the sync line. So your visualization was totally correct. You are correct in that the SNES outputs TTL level sync on the sync pin, but I believe the voltage level is still okay for RGB. But you got the important part right. You should always have the consoles outputting the way they did stock, so you never have to run into the issues that you had. And on the Super Nintendo, it's TTL level sync on the sync output. And you're always going to want to make sure to buy cables that match up with it. So, yeah, I think you've got it now. Just if you talk with other retro nerds about it, just the only correction to your to what you got in the post was on Super Nintendo, it's a resistor and a capacitor on the sync line to drop TTL level sync to video voltage. RGB just requires capacitors. On Genesis, you need all four, and on other consoles, it changes based on the console. So let me know if everything makes sense now. I think you already got it, though. It sounds like you already understand it. Mike Strobel said, regarding signal loss with the Neo Geo and Rad-2X, they can confirm this was an issue also with the early releases of the RetroTink 2X. They had a first release version 3.1 RetroTink that would also drop signal if there was a white flash on the screen. This was confirmed with both composite to the RetroTink and component using a ShinyBow SCART to component converter. They read somewhere this had something to do with the white signal voltage being too high and the RetroTink couldn't handle it. I'm not sure the specifics of why, but it would happen. I also read this would happen with certain Sega games. I can report that the new RetroTink 2X Pro has corrected the issue and the Neo Geo runs flawlessly now. Not sure if those cables can have a firmware update, but maybe that would fix it. That's really interesting. I got to talk to Mike, the RetroTink creator, about all of this stuff. So one issue with all analog consoles is in order for perfect video output, each color, red, green, and blue, needs to be at exactly 714 millivolts. I think I got that one correct. But they never really are. Most are below, which is fine, because if it's a little bit too low, you could just turn the brightness up or not notice at all, to be perfectly honest. If it's a little too high, it could cause issues like this, as well as blooming, and you really lose all the color information. So even if you turn the brightness down, it's still that washed out picture. Kind of just like if you take an overexposed picture somewhere, you can't just darken it up. It's still all bloomed out and not good. But also, all of the components in these classic consoles were not audiophile grade components, let's say. So the resistors on them were probably 5 to 10% tolerance, which means that, if you have a 100 ohm resistor, that could be as low as 90 or as high as 110. And all of the components in these, because they're consumer level devices, probably were around that. So theoretically, you could end up with a random Neo Geo, Genesis, whatever console that has voltage spikes that go higher, much higher than that. And modern equipment is designed to not blow out for a small spike. I mean, if you had like a 5-volt spike, who knows what would happen. But if it spikes up, it could trip a reset function in that. So this is 100% speculation. So that could be an issue. It could be a firmware that just said raise the level of trip up. But thank you for sharing the info. I'll talk to Mike about that and see if there's a different way to fix it or go about doing it, or go about repairing that some way. There's got to be different things that you can do to tweak this. Of course, doing any kind of RGB bypass that includes a board or components that are 1% tolerance resistors, which these days we're still talking about 20 cents a resistor, so it's not like you have to spend dollars per. That should also fix it as well. Of course, you shouldn't have to mod your console if you're using a plug and play solution. I'm just kind of throwing all this stuff out here. So thanks very much for letting me know. I'll follow up with Mike and see if there's anything we could do about this, but at the very least, it seems to be not be a common issue. It does happen, but maybe there's one Rev Neo Geo or something that's constantly having issues. I don't know, but thank you for the info. Orlando Lewis wants to know if I can recommend anybody that calibrates and repairs CRTs of many different manufacturers of all different sizes. And the short answer is yes, but it takes forever, so it's going to be extremely expensive. And just some background on this. Your average CRT can't just be calibrated because the capacitors are aging as well as some other components. And not only can you not get a perfect calibration, but if you try to force it without changing those other components, when you eventually do change those components, it's going to be way off. So in order to do this right, in most cases, I have seen some fairly new-ish monitors that are mint, but in most cases, you're going to need to replace some, if not all, of the capacitors first, then do the calibration on it. Then, depending on the model TV, you might not have a lot of service menu options, so you might then start to need convergence strips, magnets, and all of these things are super time consuming, especially the capacitors, because in most cases you have to make your own list. And now, of course, the wiki will have places that people could store this stuff, but at the moment, you're going to make your own list, then you have to go buy all of those capacitors, which, once again, I'm looking to try to integrate some kind of automatic capacitor thing into the wiki, but even then you're still going to need to double check where to buy all this stuff, and then you're going to sit there and replace 200 capacitors and then start the calibration. So there's a ton of work that goes into all of this. It sounds like you already know that, but I just wanted for other people listening to understand, because I think over the years some people have seen some of the videos I've done and some of the people I've talked to reached out for CRT work and their eyes bugged out of their head when they heard how much it cost, and it's a fair price. Unfortunately, it's just kind of the way it is. I am working on some preservation projects, and I know that P word is abused by everybody today who wants attention for that stuff, but some actual preservation projects for CRTs, and I'm really looking for a way to do a lot of the stuff that you're talking about and kind of have educational guides on it to help people do it themselves. So please reach out, maybe DM me and let me know where you're located, what country and what region, and if you have a list of the CRTs you have, because maybe I could help out, or maybe you'd want to be part of the preservation thing that I'm working on. But anyway, I hope that was a decent enough answer. I'm sorry that I went straight to it's going to be super expensive, but I do want to make sure I curb everybody's expectations. ABO Hiccups was hoping that I had some information on the upcoming Analogue Pocket, and I genuinely do not. No disrespect, but I do still talk to Kevin. I do still consider him a friend, but I choose to never cross the line and ask him stuff that I shouldn't know the answers to. So I know about as much as you do about the Analogue Pocket. My apologies. Joshua Boyd posted in regards to a question about HDMI to SDI conversion and wanted to clarify the color space conversion, and really went into technical detail about how the SDI standard has changed over the years and how initially an SDI converter would only have been 422, and it wasn't until there were different enhancements over the years that allowed for 444. There's some pretty great information in here that I actually tried reading out loud a few times, but I kept stumbling across my words. So rather than mumble through it again, sorry, Joshua, I do appreciate the time that you took to write this. I'll just skip to the end and say you need to find a dual link adapter that is specifically rated at 444. So you can't just go out and buy an HDMI to SDI adapter and assume it does the full color space. You need to check the specs and find out. And you also need to double check the input card on your BVM to make sure that it can be used. So that's a pretty interesting thing. I didn't really think to check both of those, and I didn't have time to really go into the research for this. Generally speaking, I prefer just doing HDMI to component when I'm doing that on my BVMs. There have been a few times where HDSDI was an easier thing to do, whether it was for input purposes or just that was the adapter that I had. But I don't think I ever really looked into each individual input card, and the adapters. So awesome information to share. Thank you very much. And maybe I'll try to look into this at some point when I do a video on, HDMI to HDSDI for these purposes. But thanks for taking the time to write all that technical info. A few more quick questions from ABO Hiccups. Is there a way to back up GameCube games without using a GameCube or a Wii? If you have certain optical drives, you can use a PC to rip them. I would check out the Dolphin Wiki for that. And does Analog FPGA clone consoles output 120 frames per second on any 120 hertz TV? No, as far as I know, the answer is no. It only is 60 hertz HDMI output. And lastly, Firebrand X was just chiming in about Boli's question from last week. If they have an AES 3.3 or 3.4, they may be interested in doing the audio restoration fix on the stereo headphone output from Firebrand X's website guide. This gets rid of annoying buzzing sound that contaminates the noise floor. They could also use the RGB bypass guide for those same revisions as well. So, Bo, definitely check out Firebrand X's site on that stuff, and thanks, FBX, for chiming in on that. Well, that's it for this week. If you're new to these Q&As, please ask any question you'd like wherever it is that you support in the newest Q&A post. The way they're set up, I can't really filter out questions on older weeks that I haven't answered yet, so please just ask any question you would like wherever it is that you support. And I don't read the YouTube comments for these, simply because this is a way that I interact with the supporters and subscribers that have been helping keep all of this stuff going for so long. So absolutely no disrespect for people that just want to listen and aren't part of the support services. I still make it public for everybody, and I've still answered thousands of questions in the YouTube comments over the years, just not on these videos. I have to leave the comments on for algorithm reasons, but don't mean any disrespect by this to anybody. This is really just a thank you and a celebration of people that support, and kind of a fun thing that I like to do to interact with everybody. So ask any questions you want in the support pages, not on YouTube. Thank you so much for participating, and if I ever miss a question, please just re-ask it, because it's usually a mistake. It's usually I accidentally deleted a file in post or something like that. So as always, thank you so much for all of your support, and I will see you next week.